Welcome to this explainer. I want you to just look around you for a second. That smartphone in your pocket, the coffee sitting on your desk right now, these everyday items are actually part of this massive, deeply unequal global web. So today we're going to dive into one of the biggest, most significant questions in the contemporary world. Why exactly does global economic inequality exist? We're going to use three totally different sociological lenses to explore this. And remember, try to think of these theories not as competing absolute facts, but more like different vantage points that help us piece together this giant global puzzle. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the inequality question itself, then walk through modernization theory, Rostow's 4 stages, dependency theory, modern world system theory, and finally, we'll compare the theories side by side. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the inequality question. So, for literally most of human history, poverty wasn't the exception. It was just the norm everywhere. But then, the Industrial Revolution came along and completely changed the rules of the game. It concentrated incredible wealth in very specific parts of the globe. And that brings us to the core question we are trying to answer today. Why are some countries so rich and powerful, while others remain much poorer or economically dependent? Well, there's no single easy answer, so we're going to look at 3 distinct theories that attempt to explain it. Moving on to part 2, modernization theory. Our first lens actually requires us to zoom all the way in on the internal workings of individual nations. Modernization theory basically argues that global stratification is a direct result of a country's own internal technological and cultural choices. It suggests that the absolute biggest barrier to economic growth is the tension a country faces from within. Basically, do they hold on to deep-rooted traditional cultural values, or do they embrace sweeping technological change? According to this perspective, real development gets triggered when countries fully embrace industrialization. We're talking about machines replacing human labor and adopting brand new technologies. But it's not just about tech. It also requires a massive social shift. Think prioritizing individualism and personal wealth over traditional communal living. Historically, the argument is that Western European nations that made this massive cultural shift saw huge improvements in their standard of living, while the nations that held on to their traditions, well, they lagged behind. Which brings us to part 3, Rostow's 4 stages. To show exactly how a country modernizes internally, American economist Walt Rostow created this really clear 4-step roadmap. First up is the traditional society, where small communities are basically farming just for their own survival. Second is the takeoff stage. Here, people start innovating, producing a surplus beyond just what they need, and they start trading. Third is the drive to technological maturity. This is where a society builds diverse, complex industries, and poverty levels finally begin to drop significantly. And finally, stage 4, a society reaches high mass consumption. Production here is no longer just about survival. It's geared toward everyday consumer wants and luxuries. It's the mall, the smartphone, the extra car. Now, no theory is without its critics, right? Opponents of modernization theory are quick to point out that it is inherently Eurocentric. It just assumes Western capitalism is the one and only valid path to progress. Plus, it conveniently ignores some pretty harsh historical realities. I mean, it completely overlooks how early European progress was largely fueled by outside exploitation, like colonialism, slavery, and resource depletion. Ultimately, the critics argue that this theory kind of blames the victim. It faults poor countries for holding onto their culture while totally ignoring the aggressive outside forces that actively held them back. Let's shift gears to part 4, dependency theory. So this brings us to our second lens, where we are going to zoom out. Developed largely by Latin American scholars who were reflecting on their own region's struggles, dependency theory argues that global inequality is completely tied to historic and ongoing economic exploitation. Instead of asking what poor countries are doing wrong internally, like modernization theory does, dependency theory looks at how they have been historically wronged by richer nations. And we're talking way back, starting in the 1500s with European colonialism. The key concept to grasp here is the highly unequal relationship between core and peripheral nations. Peripheral nations, those are the less developed countries, are essentially forced to rely on manual labor and exporting very cheap raw materials. Core nations, the highly industrialized wealthy ones, take those cheap materials, process them into finished goods like electronics or cars, and then sell them right back to the peripheral nations at a massive markup. And you can probably guess what happens. This creates a vicious, totally unbreakable cycle. The whole system is fundamentally designed to funnel wealth upwards, straight toward the wealthy core. Because of this totally lopsided trade dynamic, poorer countries are essentially drained of their own resources. They simply can't accumulate the capital they need to build their own factories or infrastructure. This means they are stuck, perpetually dependent on the core nations for financial aid and manufactured goods. But just like our last theory, dependency theory definitely has its critics. Some argue it treats the entire global economy as a zero-sum game. Basically, it assumes that one country getting richer absolutely must mean another is getting poorer, which ignores how widespread technological growth can actually benefit everyone. It also really struggles to explain historical anomalies. For instance, why did uncolonized nations like Ethiopia remain poor? Or, on the flip side, why did former colonies like Singapore become incredibly wealthy? Finally, critics point out that it's great at pointing fingers, but it fails to offer practical, actionable solutions for countries navigating today's complex global market. All right, let's explore our final lens in Part 5, Modern World System Theory. For this third and final perspective, we need to take a wide-angle view of the entire planet. Developed by American sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein, the Modern World System Theory views the global economy as a single, highly complex capitalist machine that spans across multiple nations. Under this theory, the problem isn't that the world lacks wealth, not at all. Instead, it argues that the global economic structure itself is perfectly, intentionally designed to distribute that wealth unequally. Wallerstein categorized the world into three interconnected positions. You've got the core, that's the manufacturing base absorbing the world's wealth. You have the periphery, the low-income providers of cheap raw materials. But crucially, he added a middle tier, the semi-periphery. These are middle-income countries with much closer economic ties to the core. This entire model illustrates how core nations literally rely on the structured exploitation of the periphery to maintain their high standards of living. It's all one giant interconnected ecosystem. And because peripheral countries completely lack their own industrial capacity within the system, they are forced to import those expensive manufactured goods we talked about earlier. This deeply unequal trade forces them to borrow money from richer nations just to stay afloat. So what happens? They become trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle of massive international debt within this wider global web. And that debt makes it nearly impossible for them to ever invest in their own domestic development. Okay, let's wrap things up in Part 6, Comparing the Theories. Let's put these three models side by side to review exactly what we've covered. Modernization theory focuses strictly on internal factors. A country's development depends on its own technological and social choices. Dependency theory, on the other hand, shifts the focus entirely to relationships, highlighting the historical economic exploitation of poorer countries by wealthier ones. And finally, world system theory zooms all the way out, arguing that countries just occupy different, deeply interconnected positions within one massive, structured, global capitalist system. So there you have it. These three theories offer entirely distinct ways to analyze the exact same global data. They're a great reminder that the global economy is incredibly complex and there really are no easy, one-size-fits-all answers. So I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. As you look at the immense economic divides in our contemporary world today, which of these lenses actually makes the most sense to you? And more importantly, how might we use these different insights to start solving the very real challenge of global stratification? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep asking those big questions.